Looking through the grimy window of a westbound train somewhere in the Kansas plains, Werner Hartmann couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The young German soldier, barely 20 years old and holding the rank of Feldwebel, had been riding these rails for 72 hours straight since the convoy left Camp Shanks up in New York, and every mile that rolled past seemed to contradict everything he'd been told about America. The train was slowing down again, pulling into another station in what the sign said was Amarillo, Texas. Standing there on the wooden platform, leaning against a post like he had all the time in the world, was a man who looked like he'd stepped right out of one of those Western films. Leather chaps worn smooth with use, a hat with a brim so wide it cast his whole face in shadow, and he was rolling himself a cigarette with practiced fingers while he watched the train pull in. Hartmann stared because this wasn't some actor on a movie screen or a propaganda poster meant to mock American culture. This was an actual cowboy, real as the desert dust that seemed to hang in the air around him, squinting into that brutal Texas sun like it was nothing. Hartmann was one of almost 500 German prisoners packed into that train, all of them heading deeper into a country that their propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had insisted was barely civilized at all. Most of these men had fought in North Africa under Rommel, soldiers from the Afrika Korps who'd been captured at places like Kasserine Pass or during the final collapse in Tunisia, some grabbed up in Sicily when the Allies pushed through. These were men who'd gone into battle expecting to die in the sand, and they'd been right about the dying part, but completely wrong about which desert it would be. The entire Nazi propaganda apparatus had spent years preparing them for what American captivity would be like, and every single thing they'd been told pointed to one conclusion. It would be hell. The Americans were supposed to be barbaric, uncivilized, a mongrel nation of mixed races who had no culture worth speaking of and certainly no honor. They were soft and decadent, a country of gangsters and cowboys playing at being a real nation, and they would treat captured German soldiers worse than animals, because that's what uncultured mongrels did. The first crack in that carefully constructed worldview had appeared on the transport ships crossing the Atlantic. They'd been given white bread, the kind of bread that German soldiers hadn't seen in months, maybe years. Real coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the burnt grain substitute they'd been choking down. 3 hot meals every single day, and not just watery soup or stale bread, but actual food in quantities that seemed excessive. It was the same rations that American soldiers received, because that's what the Geneva Convention required, and the Americans apparently took that seriously. Now, as the landscape outside transformed from plains to something more arid and endless, the contradictions just kept piling up. Through those train windows they could see farmland that stretched beyond the horizon, massive herds of cattle that seemed to go on forever, oil derricks pumping away at the black gold buried under Texas soil, towns with electric lights burning even in the daytime, paved roads that didn't turn to mud when it rained, and automobiles everywhere, not just a few, but dozens, hundreds, more cars than many of these men had seen in their entire lives. One of the prisoners would eventually sit down and write a letter to his family back home, and in that letter he'd try to explain what he was seeing. "The Americans have so much of everything," he wrote, "and they even share it with their enemies. How do you explain that to people living under rationing and bombing? How do you make someone understand abundance when they're standing in line for a single loaf of bread?" The buses rolled through the gates of Camp Hearn, about 30 miles northwest of Houston, a facility that had been built to hold nearly 5,000 prisoners. What the Germans saw as those buses pulled to a stop wasn't what they'd been trained to expect. This wasn't a prison camp in the brutal sense they'd imagined. It looked more like someone had picked up a small American town and dropped it down in the middle of Texas cotton country. They'd expected machine gun towers on every corner, guards with attack dogs patrolling the perimeter, brutal treatment from day one. Instead, they found themselves looking at barracks that had electricity running to them, indoor plumbing that actually worked, hot showers that produced steam, flush toilets instead of the latrines they'd known in the Wehrmacht. These were amenities that plenty of these men hadn't had access to back home in Germany, even before the war. The camp commander stood in front of them, speaking through a translator who turned his English into German and laid out the rules in a way that seemed almost impossibly simple. They would work 8 hours a day, just like any other labourer. They would follow the camp regulations and cause no trouble. In exchange for this, they would receive 3 substantial meals every day, wages of 80 cents for every day they worked that would be given to them in camp scrip they could use at the canteen, privileges to buy small luxuries, time for recreation and sports, and they'd be allowed to send and receive mail from whatever was left of home. Friedrich Becker, who held the rank of Unteroffizier, stood there trying to process what he was hearing. Wages? They were going to pay prisoners of war actual money? The same rate that American privates earned, which worked out to about $50 a month? It didn't make any sense according to everything he'd been taught about how the world worked. When morning came, they were introduced to their work supervisors, and this was another surprise because these weren't military officers or prison guards. These were ranchers and cotton farmers and cattlemen, men with skin weathered by decades under the sun, wearing worn denim and leather boots that had clearly seen years of hard use. These were men who desperately needed hands for the harvest because the American agricultural system was churning out food to feed half the free world, but American boys were busy fighting their way up the Italian peninsula and getting ready for the invasion of France. The Texas cotton fields went on for thousands and thousands of acres, and without workers to bring in the harvest, all of it would just rot in the fields. These German prisoners represented the answer to every farmer's prayer. A rancher by the name of John Davidson looked over the group of prisoners standing in front of him, evaluating them the way he might evaluate horses at auction. He needed 40 men for his cotton fields, and he started pointing at the biggest and strongest Germans he could spot. Then he did something that brought the whole proceeding to a sudden halt. He walked right over to the group, extended his hand toward the nearest prisoner, and introduced himself like they were equals meeting at a social function. In Texas, he explained while the translator scrambled to keep up, men shake hands before they work together. That's just how it's done. Wilhelm Müller held the rank of Obergefreiter, and he stood there staring at that extended hand like it was some kind of weapon he didn't recognize. 6 months earlier, he'd been shooting at Americans in the Tunisian desert, trying to kill them before they killed him. Now one of them wanted to shake his hand like they were partners in some kind of business arrangement. He reached out slowly and took the offered hand, and Davidson's grip was firm and calloused, the hand of a man who'd spent his whole life working with his body instead of just giving orders. It was a working man's hand, honest and rough, and it changed something in Müller that he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. The cotton fields of Brazos County seemed to go on until they hit the curve of the earth, endless rows of white bolls waiting to be picked under a sun that beat down with relentless intensity. The work itself was absolutely brutal, the kind of labour that left your back screaming and your fingers bleeding, hauling 100-pound sacks until your shoulders felt like they'd been dislocated. But something extraordinary started happening out there in those fields, something that would have been impossible anywhere else in the world in the year 1943. The German prisoners found themselves working alongside Mexican migrant workers who'd come north for the harvest, black sharecroppers who'd been farming this land for generations, and poor white tenant farmers who didn't own the soil they tilled. The racial hierarchy that the Nazis had preached about, the careful ordering of humanity into superior and inferior peoples, just crumbled into dust under that Texas sun. Everyone sweated the same. Everyone's back ached with the same fire. Everyone drank from the same water bucket when it came around, because thirst doesn't care about ideology. When noon rolled around, a woman named Rosa Martinez, who cooked for the ranch hands, would ring the dinner bell, and the prisoners had steeled themselves for bread and water, maybe some thin soup if they were lucky. Instead, they got beef stew thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, cornbread that was still warm from the oven, sweet tea cold enough to make your teeth ache, and apple pie for dessert. Rosa didn't speak a word of German, and these prisoners didn't speak Spanish, but she'd ladle extra portions onto their plates and smile at them like they were just regular workers deserving of a good meal. Food, it turned out, was a language that everyone understood, regardless of where they'd been born. Werner Hartmann would carry the memory of that meal with him for the rest of his life, and it wasn't because the food was particularly special, though it was better than anything he'd eaten in years. It was because a Mexican woman had treated German prisoners with the exact same kindness and generosity she showed to everyone else who worked those fields. The Third Reich had told him this was impossible, that racial mixing led to degradation and chaos, that different peoples couldn't exist together in harmony. The Third Reich had been completely and utterly wrong. Saturday night at Camp Herne, the recreation hall would fill up with music, but it wasn't the military marches they'd grown up with or the Nazi anthems they'd been required to sing. This was Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys coming through the radio, that distinctive sound of Western swing that was pure American in 1943. After Italy switched sides in September of that year, the Italian POWs got more freedoms, including permission to attend local dances under careful supervision. The German prisoners would watch with something like envy, but some camps eventually started allowing carefully monitored social events for them too. Always supervised, always controlled, but still it represented a slice of normal life in the middle of a war. The prisoners formed their own bands, started learning American songs from the radio, and some of them even began writing new music that blended German folk melodies with Western swing rhythms. It was music that existed nowhere else in the world, a strange hybrid that could only have been born in these specific circumstances. The letters home created their own crisis for the prisoners. What could they possibly write? How could they describe any of this to families who were suffering through Allied bombing campaigns, to mothers standing in ration lines for hours just to get a bit of bread, to wives who hadn't seen meat in months and months? Friedrich Becker sat down to write to his wife back in Hamburg, and he struggled with every sentence. "The Americans are not what we were told," he finally wrote. "They have given us warm clothes and good boots that actually fit. We eat meat every single day. I am saving my wages so that when I come home we will have money to start over." He didn't mention the sheer abundance that surrounded him on every side, the fact that every farmer seemed to own a car, that electric lights burned all night long without anyone worrying about the cost, that stores in the nearby towns were packed with goods that would have been luxuries back home. How could he explain that? She wouldn't believe it anyway, and the censors probably wouldn't let it through even if he tried to describe it accurately. Up at Camp McLean near Amarillo, the cowboy aesthetic wasn't just decoration or atmosphere. These were real working cowboys who needed help managing thousands of head of cattle spread across enormous ranches. Thomas Anderson, who owned one of the bigger spreads in the area, looked over the group of new workers the camp had sent him and tried not to sigh too loudly. Luftwaffe pilots who'd flown fighters, panzer crews who'd driven tanks, U-boat sailors who'd never seen the sun for months at a time. Not a single one of them had ever been within 100 yards of a cow, let alone knew how to work with one. "This is going to be interesting," he muttered to himself, and that was putting it mildly. He started with the absolute basics, the kind of things a ranch boy would learn before he could walk. How to approach a horse without spooking it, how to hold a rope properly, how to read an animal's body language so you didn't get kicked, bitten, or trampled into the dirt. The Germans were terrified of the animals, these huge creatures that could kill you with one wrong move. The animals, for their part, were deeply suspicious of these strange-smelling men who moved wrong and spoke in harsh foreign syllables. It was mutual distrust at first sight, a standoff between species and cultures. But Anderson was patient in a way that surprised even him. His own son was somewhere over Germany right now, flying B-17 bombing missions against the same country these boys had fought for. These prisoners standing in front of him were someone's sons too, enemy or not. They were here, the cattle needed working, and cows didn't give a damn about politics or nationality. Within a few weeks, something almost magical started to happen. The Germans took to ranching like they'd been born to it, learning faster than Anderson had expected. Maybe it was their military discipline translating well to the structured work of managing livestock. Maybe it was their engineering minds appreciating the logistics involved in moving huge herds across vast distances. Or maybe it was just that working with animals felt honest in a way that war had never been, direct and real and uncomplicated by ideology. One of the prisoners, Hauptmann Erich Schmidt, who'd been a captain in the Luftwaffe, became Anderson's best horseman within a couple of months. He could rope cattle as well as any of the ranch hands, brand them efficiently, and doctor sick animals with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his military background. At night, when the work was done, he'd sit outside the bunkhouse and sketch the landscape, capturing mesas at sunset and longhorns silhouetted against the sky, cowboys and Germans working side by side with the animals. These were images that would have been impossible anywhere else in the world in 1943. Drawings that documented something that wasn't supposed to exist. Sunday mornings within the camps brought a different kind of freedom. The German prisoners were allowed to hold their own religious services, with Lutheran ministers and Catholic priests among the POWs leading worship for their fellow prisoners. The American military actually provided them with hymnals and religious materials, respecting their freedom of religion even though they were enemies of the state. Some camps would even arrange special permits that allowed small groups of prisoners to attend local churches on major holidays, carefully supervised, but still permitted to worship alongside Americans. Christmas of 1944 brought a moment that nobody had anticipated. A handful of German POWs sat in the back pews of a small American church, probably in Texas or Arizona, and when the congregation began singing Silent Night, they knew every single word. The hymn had been written in German originally, Stille Nacht, and these men had grown up singing it every Christmas since they were children. By the time the congregation reached the third verse, some of the prisoners were crying openly, tears running down their faces that they didn't bother to wipe away. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was the profound shock of being treated as human beings in an enemy land, of being allowed to worship and remember home and feel something other than hatred or fear. December 23, 1944, at Camp Papago Park out in Arizona, 25 U-boat sailors had been digging in secret for 3 solid months. Their tunnel stretched 178 feet beyond the camp fence, shored up with whatever materials they could scrounge or steal. Tonight was the night they'd planned for, the night they would escape and float down the Salt River all the way to Mexico, where they could live free until Germany won the war and came to rescue them. The plan was brilliant in its conception and absolutely stupid in its execution, though they didn't know that yet. They'd built a collapsible boat from scraps, studied old maps of the area, saved up food from their rations. Everything was ready. Lieutenant Hans Werner Krauss led the way through the tunnel, emerging into the Arizona desert under a full moon that lit up the landscape like a stage. Freedom tasted like dust and possibility. They ran toward where the river should have been, where the maps said it would be, and then they stopped dead in their tracks. The Salt River was dry, completely and utterly dry. Not a drop of water, just sand and rocks and the occasional scrub brush. The maps they'd used were from 1880, drawn before the dams were built, before irrigation systems rerouted all the water to the farms and cities. Their boat was useless. Their plan was dead before it had really begun. They scattered into the desert in different directions, figuring that spreading out would make them harder to catch. Within hours, they were hopelessly lost. The Arizona desert in December is a brutal place that freezes at night and burns during the day, and they had almost no water, hardly any food, and absolutely no idea where they were or which direction led to Mexico. Johann Kremer, who'd been an Unteroffizier on a submarine, stumbled into a gas station somewhere near Phoenix after 3 days of freedom. He was sunburned so badly his skin was peeling, dehydrated to the point of hallucination, barely able to stand upright. The attendant was an old man named Pete who took one look at this stumbling German and gave him water first, made him a sandwich second, and only then called the authorities to come pick him up. While they waited for the police to arrive, Pete shared his coffee and talked about his own son who was fighting somewhere in the Pacific. Two fathers' sons, one lost in the desert and one lost in a war that seemed like it would never end. Jürgen Wartenberg, who'd been the captain of the escaping group, made it the furthest of any of them. He actually reached downtown Phoenix and was sitting on a bench on Van Buren Street on January 28th when a street cleaner noticed his accent and got suspicious. The police found him exhausted, homesick, and honestly ready to go back to the camp. Even escaped and free, America was still America, abundant and comfortable and impossible to hate the way the propaganda had taught them to hate. Spring of 1945 brought a shift in mood throughout all the camps. The war in Europe was clearly ending, grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, and in the camps the prisoners could feel it. Letters from home stopped coming through, or when they did arrive they brought news of cities reduced to rubble, families scattered or dead, a homeland that seemed to be disappearing even as they read about it. What was there to go back to? What would Germany even look like when this was all over? Thomas Anderson made an offer to his German Cowboys that he knew would be refused but felt compelled to make anyway. He told them he wished they could stay, work the ranch permanently, that he'd sponsor them if the law allowed it. The pay would be good, $100 a month plus room and board, more than they'd make anywhere in Germany even if Germany still existed as a functioning country. But the Geneva Convention was absolutely clear on this point. Prisoners must be repatriated after the war ends. No exceptions, no matter how much both sides might want to make them. They had to go home, even if home didn't exist anymore. Ranchers across Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona wrote passionate letters to their congressmen trying to explain that these weren't just prisoners anymore. They were neighbors, they were friends, they were the best workers these ranchers had ever had, and losing them would be a genuine hardship. But the law was the law, and there was no way around it, no matter how many letters got written. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the day Germany finally surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. At Camp Hearn, the prisoners gathered around radios and listened in silence as the news came through. Their country was gone, wiped off the map by total defeat. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had made it to 12 before collapsing under the weight of its own evil. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd believed in or been forced to pretend to believe in, had turned to ash and rubble. But something else had been born here in these camps, on these ranches, in these churches where they'd sung Silent Night with Americans. Understanding had been born, friendship across lines that were supposed to be uncrossable. A different future than anyone could have imagined when the first trainloads of prisoners arrived. That night, John Davidson brought a bottle of bourbon to the camp, good pre-war bourbon that he'd been saving for a special occasion. He shared it with Wilhelm Müller and the other Germans who'd worked his fields for the past 2 years, and they drank together to the end of the war, to all the dead on every side, to whatever uncertain future was coming. Müller told him, through an interpreter who'd become almost unnecessary because Müller's English had gotten so good that he wanted to come back to America when he could, if he could. America had shown him something that Germany never had, something he'd never experienced in all his years in the Wehrmacht. That strength doesn't require cruelty. That power doesn't demand hatred. That enemies can become friends over cotton fields and cattle drives and shared meals in the Texas sun. The repatriation process began in early 1946, trains reversing the journey they'd made years earlier, heading east to the ports where ships waited to carry them back to Europe, back to a Germany that had been utterly destroyed. But these Germans carried something with them that was more valuable than anything in their meagre possessions. They had knowledge, not military secrets or classified information, but something far more powerful in the long run. They knew how Americans farmed, how they organized their work, how they approached problems. They'd seen American abundance up close and understood that it wasn't magic or luck, it was methods and machinery and management, practical things that could be learned and copied and adapted to other places. More importantly, they knew Americans themselves, not the propaganda caricatures that Goebbels had fed them for years, but real Americans. Thomas Anderson teaching them to ride horses with patience and humour. Rosa Martinez ladling extra stew onto their plates with a smile that needed no translation. John Davidson shaking their hands like equals. Pete giving water to an escaped prisoner and sharing his coffee while they waited for the police. When they tried to tell these stories back in Germany, nobody believed them at first. Americans treating prisoners better than Germany had treated its own soldiers. Impossible. Paying them wages and teaching them valuable skills and sharing their churches and their homes. Pure fantasy, the delusions of men broken by captivity. But the evidence was overwhelming and couldn't be denied forever. 425,000 German POWs had worked on American farms between 1943 and 1946. They'd harvested millions of dollars worth of crops, picked cotton by the thousands of tons, saved entire harvests that would have rotted in the fields without their labor. The American agricultural miracle that fed the Allied war effort and kept Britain from starving, German prisoners of war had helped make it possible, working alongside Americans to defeat their own country. By 1950, something remarkable started happening. Immigration laws changed, loosened up in ways that created new possibilities. Former prisoners who'd been repatriated could now return to America if they wanted to, could apply for entry not as prisoners this time, but as immigrants seeking a new life in a new land. They started boarding ships in Hamburg and Bremen, carrying whatever possessions they'd managed to hold on to through the post-war chaos, heading back to the America they'd found during their captivity. One former Afrika Korps sergeant stepped off a ship in Texas in 1951, and John Davidson was there at the station waiting for him. Same handshake, same firm grip, stronger now than it had been during the war. No translator was needed anymore because his English was perfect, and it had a Texas accent that made Davidson smile. He sounded like a cowboy. He married a local girl within a year, opened a machine shop that fixed tractors and farm equipment, became a valued member of the community. His son would end up going to Texas A&M to study agriculture. His grandson would serve in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division of the United States Army. The transformation was complete, from enemy to American across 3 generations. Another former prisoner returned to Arizona where Thomas Anderson had work waiting for him, welcoming back the best horseman he'd ever trained. Eventually, this man saved up enough money to buy his own ranch, 500 acres near Tucson, where he raised quarter horses that won prizes at state fairs. His neighbors all knew his story, knew he'd been a German POW, and they didn't care one bit. In Arizona, you're judged by how you work and how you treat people, not by where you were born or what uniform you wore decades ago. Even one of the Papago Park escapees came back legally, settling in Phoenix and opening a small business not far from where he'd been recaptured all those years ago. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all him, but he'd learned that irony was just another word for second chances. Decades later, when the former POWs were old men, some of them organized reunions and made trips back to visit the camps where they'd been held. They brought photo albums filled with black and white images of young men in Wehrmacht uniforms, learning to pick cotton and rope cattle, learning that their enemies were human beings just like them. At one of these reunions, an elderly rancher whose hands shook with age stood up to speak. His voice was weaker than it had been, cracked with the weight of years, but his message came through crystal clear. "You boys came here as enemies," he told them. "You left as friends. You came back as family. That's the American way. That's the cowboy way. That's the human way." The applause went on for 5 solid minutes, former enemies embracing each other with tears running down weathered faces. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. The statistics tell one version of the story, all numbers and dates that you can verify in historical records. 425,000 German POWs held in America. 700 camps spread across 46 states. Millions and millions of dollars in agricultural labor that kept the American war effort fed and functioning. 5,000 eventually returning as immigrants to build new lives in the country that had once been their enemy. But the real story isn't in those statistics, as impressive as they are. The real story lives in the transformations that happened in the dust and heat of the American West. Nazi soldiers becoming Texas cowboys, enemies becoming neighbors and then friends, hatred dissolved by simple hospitality, propaganda shattered by the basic human kindness of sharing a meal or teaching someone to ride a horse. The Germans had expected American barbarism because that's what they'd been told to expect, what years of propaganda had drummed into their heads. They found American abundance instead, and not just the material kind, though that was impressive enough. They found an abundance of spirit, the confidence of a nation so secure in itself that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies, so strong that it could show mercy without worrying that mercy would be mistaken for weakness. In one of his final letters from Camp McLean, a prisoner whose name has been lost to history wrote to his mother back in Germany, and his words captured something essential about the whole experience. "The Americans are cowboys," he wrote, "just like that fool Goebbels said they were. But he never told us cowboys could be kind. He never told us they would share their food and their skills and their humanity without asking for anything in return. He never told us they would teach us to ride horses and repair tractors. He never told us they would shake our hands like we were equals. He never told us the truth about anything, not one single thing. The truth turned out to be simpler and more profound than any propaganda could ever be. In the American West, in the camps and on the ranches, and in the cotton fields, German prisoners of war discovered something that transcended nationality and ideology and war itself. They discovered that enemies are just strangers you haven't worked beside yet. That hatred can't survive a harvest when you're sweating shoulder to shoulder with the people you're supposed to hate. That humanity is stronger than any uniform, more powerful than any flag, more real than any border drawn on a map. They came to America as warriors of the Third Reich, soldiers of a regime built on hatred and racial supremacy and the dream of conquest. They left as cowboys, men who'd learned to ride horses and rope cattle and pick cotton under the merciless Texas sun. And in the dust of those Texas cotton fields, in the mesa shadows of New Mexico, in the desert sun of Arizona that burned away everything false, they learned the most dangerous lesson possible for any totalitarian ideology. They learned that their enemies were human beings with families and dreams and the capacity for kindness. And they learned that they were human too, not the supermen the propaganda had promised they were, just men who could learn new skills and make new friends and build new lives. The discovery almost killed them with its simplicity,